most interesting to me about this project is actually bringing together anthropologists and theologians. When I first started thinking about this project, I was thinking about the disciplines of anthropology and theology, but there are people who actually do the work of anthropology and theology, and they are called anthropologists and theologians. And what I've found is that it's a very enriching experience to have both anthropologists and theologians in the room discussing their disciplines, their contexts, their questions, and found that their questions, responses, ideas actually have come to help each other's work.
What brings me into a conversation about theology and anthropology and how they intersect is probably firstly that a lot of the people I've worked with as an anthropologist care very deeply about questions that we would define as theological questions. So we need to understand what people mean when they use those theological categories, and whether it's the same sort of thing that we as analysts would mean when we discuss what's happening to them. And secondly, I think the intersection between theology and anthropology has been a complicated historical one. Anthropology partakes of the history of Western philosophy, and so theology shapes all our categories, as John Milbank has told us.
I think what interests me about the intersection of anthropology and theology is that these are two very exciting disciplines with quite different agendas and working assumptions, but nevertheless they have the possibility of enriching each other. It just seemed to me that this was a very good opportunity to begin to ask what difference one discipline might be to the other. In other words, taking the intellectual risk of having a serious conversation where you're willing to listen to others and, if necessary, move as a result of those conversations.
So I guess one of the things that I find really fascinating about the conversation between anthropology and theology is the fact that anthropology, as far as I understand it, is historically deeply indebted to theology, but doesn't often recognize that that's the case. So one of the reasons that I'm interested in the relationship is to try and excavate where theology is in anthropology and what kind of productive new work that might be put to now, rather than simply trying to expose some past theological history to anthropology.
I'm interested in this conversation because I study anthropology of Christianity. I started looking at that in the Philippines, and then I've been looking at it in North America. Also because I teach at a confessional institution in the United States, and so my students are very interested in questions of theology and how their faith matters when they're thinking about issues of culture and anthropology. So in just my teaching, my research, my collegial interactions, this was a really present conversation, and so I'm glad to have an opportunity to really think directly about theology as a discipline, anthropology as a discipline, hear from my colleagues on sort of both sides of the aisle and get a sense of how these can come together in a really fruitful way.
What brings me to a conversation about the intersections between theology and anthropology is largely this great sense of the two being able to nourish one another in dialogue, and the dialogue really being able to inform religious practice, and at the same time some comprehension of how religious practice can inform the methodologies of anthropology. So what I'm really interested in are things that theologians often take for granted: moods, patterns of behaviour, the kind of grounded realities of what I call ecclesial life. So not the great things that people talk about, articles of faith and creeds and councils and doctrines, but why do people sit where they sit in church, and why do they have coffee afterwards, and what do they think's going on in an ordinary parish meeting?
So the reason that I wanted to participate in a conversation about the intersection of theology and anthropology is that my own fieldwork raised theological questions quite a lot, and specifically what I interpreted to be theological work that was being undertaken by the people that I studied. So the community where I work has had quite a lot of exposure to the prosperity gospel, Christian prosperity gospel, which, you know, in time was starting to sort of erode, I think, a little bit in people's experience. They were feeling that the prosperity gospel really wasn't working or delivering on its promises. And as a result, they were confronted with sort of bigger questions about the way that they had understood God to work and the way that they had understood God to be and operate in the world. And they were forced to sort of reconsider some of those ideas that they had taken to be true. And I take that work to be theological work. So I'm quite interested really in theology as an ethnographic object.
In retrospect, much of my work over the last decade or more has actually been on this precise boundary. And initially it was more trying to apply anthropology to religious studies and religious texts, and more lately trying to figure out what theology, if that's the right term, might have to contribute to anthropology. Theology, of course, carries its own weight of expectation and history. It's usually a Christian term, so I'm not sure if that's the right term, but it's close enough.
I have a very strong formation with very influential figures who have shaped some of the ways in which I pose certain kinds of issues. The two predominant ones being Peter Oakes of the University of Virginia and Timothy Jenkins in the University of Cambridge. Peter Oakes is a Jewish philosopher, but he originally studied social anthropology before moving across. And both of them are concerned with various ways in which questions of truth are handled, but also ways in which change is manifested in communities of belief and practice. So I'm drawn to the conversation partly as an attempt to make sense of two different ways to confront change and continuity. So continuity and discontinuity, I suppose. And neither discipline does it adequately by themselves. It remains to be seen whether the conversations that we're having enable us to assist each other in really fruitful ways. I certainly hope it does, and I've been extremely inspired by the various interventions that colleagues have made on both sides.
Well, I've had a long-standing interest since my doctoral work in the interface between the social sciences and theology, because I wrote my doctorate on Ernst Troeltsch, who was a great friend of Max Weber. They lived in the same house. And Troeltsch was of that brand of late 19th century, early 20th century German theology that was particularly interested in the burgeoning new social sciences and assumed that they could learn something from these disciplines. This became, of course, around the time of the First World War, extremely controversial, and as Barthianism emerged and neo-orthodoxy took flight, Troeltsch was seen as one of the betrayers of a properly Christocentric notion of revelation. And so he was larded with blame retroactively. And I was interested even in my early days in reassessing that presumption about him, which I thought was misleading. And even now I think his great work on the social teaching of the Christian churches gives theologians the kind of insight that they need to have about how any theological utterance always comes from a social context, is affected by such a social context, but is not reducible to that social context. And I've tried to extend that into my own systematic theological work, which I'm undertaking today.
A lot of my own history ends up bringing me to this, because my first fieldwork was on a very deeply Christian group, and I was one of a handful of people all around the same time in the 1990s who began to develop what came to be called the Anthropology of Christianity, the idea of taking Christianity seriously as something anthropologists could study. And as that project got off the ground and began to develop, anthropologists began reading theologians in some selective kinds of contexts, often to find out about the background of trends they thought they were seeing where they worked, or to help them understand particular Christian ideas that were important to the people they studied. And it seemed like a good next step would be to begin to see what a dialogue between theology and anthropology would look like. There had been a long history of anthropology as not just being relatively uninterested, very uninterested in studying Christianity as an object of study, but also in being seen as kind of inimical to theology and to Christian thinking in general. So that's not a dialogue that, I mean, there have been some very important moments in it, but it hadn't been a particularly vigorous dialogue. So it seemed like a next step from studying Christianity amongst the people one works with to learning a little bit more about the people who study Christianity as an intellectual project in the academy?
Well, I noticed in my own field work in the missional church movement in America that there was a significant influence of theology being spoken about by pastors and some laity. And so I started looking at kind of the theological history of this movement, but noticed that that really helped to inform my research. But I noticed that there weren't many anthropological tools to understand what to do with theology. And so it just created a question for me, and that question was, what can theology contribute to anthropology? And upon reflecting on that question, it actually made me ask the question a different way: what can anthropology contribute to theology?
I think it's very easy for interdisciplinary work to be largely one discipline tripping up another or feeling defensive. I think the way to resolve that, in fact, is to look for the best examples of work that essentially one can borrow from intelligent work done in theology if you're an anthropologist, and similarly you can be inspired by certain extraordinary works of anthropology if you're a theologian. This is rather a pragmatic point of view, but I think nevertheless, rather than having theories of how disciplines interact, my impression is that it's often what one might call the right of the masterpiece, that really good work actually can establish itself far across other boundaries, which is why, of course, it's not then confined simply to good work in anthropology or theology.
Well, even just with my own paper, one of the challenges of working with these two disciplines is that I'm much more familiar with my own discipline than I am with theology. And so having the theologians in the room to speak to what I'm trying to say in terms of theology was really helpful. But it is a challenge. I know that I'm getting things wrong. I know that I can't master a separate discipline. I don't have a PhD in theology. So we have to learn how to talk to one another, and where are the points at which we have easy connections or sort of fruitful connections, and where are the points where we have to educate one another. How do we do that in a way that yields the kinds of interesting results that we hope for? I think we're going to have to learn to translate our ideas for one another in ways that don't lose what we are most interested in our own disciplines, but at the same time make sense to the other.
So the challenges between theologians and anthropologists, between bringing anthropology and theology into conversation with each other, I think are about trying to figure out not just what the shared questions are, but also, frankly, the different assumptions that anthropology and theology use to go about answering those questions. So theology might have certain frames of reference that dramatically differ to anthropology and vice versa. And I think also both disciplines might potentially rule out of court certain types of evidence, certain types of experience as admissible evidence. And I guess trying to overcome that kind of difference is going to be fundamental.
There are enormous challenges to doing interdisciplinary work of this kind. And I would say the supreme challenge that we face on both sides is that when we're dealing in the categories and systems of classification in our own disciplines, we're really conscious about how provisional they are, how they change, and how they're produced under particular circumstances. But when we turn to another discipline, so when I as a theologian turn to social anthropology, we see all kinds of systems of classification that are in play. And we're tempted to think that they are fixed, that they're natural categories, that they've always applied, that they can be taken over without much interrogation. As a remedy to this challenge, I mean, it's always good to identify challenges, but also then to suggest how one might address them. I would say there are 3 levels of engagement which one slowly ascends through the longer the conversation goes. So at the first level, I think, in this case, theologians and anthropologists are able to rehearse each other's claims. So an anthropologist can say, it seems to me theologians say these kinds of things. And theologians can say, I notice in the anthropological work I'm reading in ethnographies, these kinds of claims are being made. It's a very significant advance, and I think it really makes the conversation more fruitful. But then the second level is to say, I discern in my colleagues' work in another discipline that there are real disagreements over how to handle these issues. So, for example, when theologians become able to spell out why structuralist and post-structuralist discourses are brought into fruitful kinds of conflict, there's a real advance. Similarly, when anthropologists considering theology are able to say, look, these theologians engaging these issues are really disagreeing very strongly. So the second level is, if you like, a way of rehearsing the field of contestation within each field, and that's an enormous advance. The third level, though, is, I think, the most interesting, which is one starts to discern where the really important points of anxiety are in each discipline. These are very rarely stated explicitly, so it can never be a question simply of rehearsing someone else's views. But when theologians are able to identify what makes anthropologists anxious and uncertain, and where the categories start to break down and fail to capture things, that's enormously fruitful. And similarly, when anthropologists are able to spot that in certain kinds of theological discourse there seem to be persistent blind spots, and they're not random, they seem to cluster around certain kinds of issue, when one can rehearse each other's uncertainties, real advances are being made. So the challenges, I think, are that we accept each other's systems of classifications as natural categories, but the solutions lie in discerning, first of all, what we say, second, what we disagree about, and third, where our major points of anxiety lie. And in the work we're doing at the moment, I think all three levels seem to be operative. These are very fruitful and hopeful signs.
Well, the challenges in any kind of interdisciplinary work are being careful not to misunderstand one another. I think there are a lot of possible false friends in the discussions between anthropology and theology, and hopefully we've been trying to excavate some of those in the past couple of days. And the challenges are really linked to the potentials, and we can try and unlock those meanings and understand people's lives better as anthropologists and practitioners.
Well, I think there are obviously challenges to having this conversation between theology and anthropology. I think the biggest one is that people will suspect that you are blending these two disciplines so they lose their distinct identity, or in effect that you are in effect using completely incommensurate assumptions as the basis of these conversations. I think this is an intellectual risk you have to take. And in many ways, by having this conversation, you're opening the possibility of having conversations not simply about outcomes, but also assumptions and methods, which actually could be challenging, but also, I think, very enriching. It's a way of broadening our horizons without losing our own distinct emphasis and identity.
Any kind of interdisciplinary effort carries a lot of challenges with it, and that's true, for example, of the anthropological engagement with science and medicine, just as much as it is with theology. I don't view this as being uniquely challenging in some way. Different disciplines have their own epistemological structures. They have their own ways of knowing. They have their own histories and their own infights between partisans. And it's challenging to get to know those well enough to speak intelligently. But I like to think that anthropology is devoted more than anything to figuring out how to understand other kinds of worlds, other kinds of life worlds, other kinds of epistemologies. And therefore, I think it's well suited to this project. I approach this project largely from the corner of anthropology, although I guess I could make a case that I do theology in other contexts as well. Here, I think there's a particular challenge, which is that because theology because we're not sure whether by theology we mean an academic discipline with its particular histories and resonances, or whether we mean, as I kind of lean towards, something much broader than that, that might include vernacular theologies, that certainly includes religious contexts outside of Christianity, and forms of Christianity that are not well represented in the academic scene. So for me, figuring out how to negotiate both the academic discipline of theology, but also something much broader that encompasses that, is still a challenge we haven't quite figured out how to do.
I think one of the challenges is that anthropologists and theologians really have very different intellectual formations. We do have some texts in common, but theologians speak on the background of a tremendous amount of knowledge anthropologists don't have, and anthropologists often speak on the background of a tremendous amount of knowledge that theologians don't have, trying to figure out how much to share of our intellectual backgrounds and which parts of it to share, I think is a really important task. And for the conversation to continue to grow and get richer, we're going to have to do some of that. We're probably going to have to get beyond, the theologians have read a few articles by Clifford Geertz or Victor Turner, which are nothing. It's not that those aren't great articles to read, but by the same token that the anthropologists have read one or two pieces of theology, eventually we will have to work our way into parts of what you would get as part of your formation if you were trained in these different fields. You can never replicate. There are those unique individuals who are trained in both, but without that, we have to figure out a way to bring our backgrounds to bear for each other. I also think one of the ideas that somewhat caught on in this conference is one of the participants, Douglas Davies, talked about we need to find a way to celebrate together. And I think what he meant is we need to find a way to have really high point intellectual moments together, the kind you might have at the end of a really good class period, or even when you're reading a really good text and you finally understand it and you have a kind of intellectual moment of effervescence, as Durkheim would say. How to have those together, and I think part of getting those together requires a certain kind of putting out your really fundamental commitments to each other, because it's when you start to move with those that you have the possibility of having these kind of moments of really strong reaction together and production of intellectual solidarity. And so I think it is a challenge. People talked at the end of this conference a lot about sort of building trust as a way of allowing that to happen. I do think one of the next steps is for people to be able to come with some of the thoughts that are really so important to them that they often don't even voice them outside of, say, the undergraduate classroom. I think to talk to each other in those ways would lead to an even further, even more. A differently productive kind of dialogue, but I think it takes a lot of time to get there.
Lots of challenges because all disciplines like to circle the wagons around themselves, even though they themselves, of course, are internally fractured. And the more they're internally fractured, the more the intensity of the need to protect themselves. So the only way that we can move forward is to gather together groups of theologians and anthropologists who are willing to be vulnerable to each other, it seems to me. This is true in all interdisciplinary engagements. And this can't be hurried because too much is at stake. And youthful scholars are particularly endangered by premature interdisciplinary work, because this can undermine their capacity to get or retain jobs. So we have to be politically astute about this. My feeling is that this is quite a long-term undertaking, and for that reason it needs some financial commitment from bodies that will enable it to occur. And it's also going to involve a lot of introspection, which the other discipline will aid the disciplinary focus to undertake. For the most part, we go on doing our work within either theology or anthropology with a set of enemies that we've identified close to hand, another set of enemies outside our discipline that we presume that we know about but probably don't know very much about. And when we trouble or disturb those dialectical relationships, it takes quite a lot of time for things to resettle.
I find it really quite exciting to think that people who are committed to theological ways of understanding human life on the one hand, and people committed to anthropological ways of understanding human behaviour on the other, might in their discussion have ideas jumping the gap between them, as it were, and creating new perspectives in the process.
So I think the exciting thing about bringing anthropology and theology together is the chance to not just engage in a kind of shared dialogue between anthropologists and theologians, but to play on a phrase that Joel Robbins and Matthew Angelke has spoken about. It's about not just thinking about religion, but thinking with it. And I think if we can productively engage with that kind of dialogue, then we're headed in the right direction.
There's no doubt at all that anthropology deals well in smaller scale human events, and that theology doesn't deal badly in questions of institutions, but it also deals really very excitingly at times at rather large scale notions like redemption, salvation, and indeed the conclusion to human history, things like that, which then of course have effects within small communities. So I think I find a certain completeness if you deal in these different levels and scales at which things happen.
I think that this conversation can contribute to the way that we think about and maybe think with the notion of God as an actor in the world, as an intervening force, which again, certainly from an anthropological perspective, if that's not true sort of for anthropologists in the way that we write about the world, generally speaking, it is quite true for the world that our informants live in most of the time. I think what theology can do for that is give us maybe a bit of a language and give us a little bit more of, at least give us a place to consider more seriously what it might mean to think about God and what it might mean to talk about God as at least a well-rounded or sort of more fully formed actor than we have been able to do prior to this. I think perhaps maybe pushing anthropology back onto theology, one of the things that I've seen in this discussion is anthropology has quite a lot to say about the nature of the person, and if at least in the Christian tradition we might say that God is a person, anthropology can open up sort of, I think, ways to think about the nature of God in a theological context that maybe wouldn't have been part of that conversation before. In terms of what the intersection of anthropology and theology can bring to politics, I think that one of the great things, as Joel Robbins and other people have pointed out about theology, is that it's not afraid to speak in much bolder terms, much broader terms, much more programmatic terms, maybe even normative terms than anthropology has been willing to recently, with exceptions to that, of course. But generally speaking, anthropology has been kind of mired in much more small-scale, particularist types of arguments than any sort of bold or sweeping claims about the way that the world is, or much less the way the world ought to be. Theology, for all kinds of reasons, is more committed to those sorts of claims, those sorts of ideas. I think if anthropology is to have any sort of political legs, any sort of political impact in this kind of late capitalist period, we might call it, or this time when there's a sort of growing discontent globally with the kind of capitalist world order, anthropology is going to have to position itself in such a way that it's able to make those sorts of broad claims about how the world ought to be, informed again by a deeply sort of particularist understanding of human experience, which is what anthropology does best, I think. But the boldness and the willingness to make those sorts of claims is something I think we can learn from theology.
Well, for me, what's most exciting about bringing together anthropology and theology is the possibility that I might get to understand what theology is. And as an anthropologist, I find that really a wonderful proposition. It's very hard to understand somebody else's discipline properly from the outside. And the best way is probably the ethnographic method, that you meet practitioners and you ask them what they're doing. And, if they're kind, they'll let you know.
I think that theology and anthropology traditionally haven't really talked to each other very much. And I sense a new openness, certainly part of anthropologists, to having these conversations. And so I think that the very fact this is happening is in itself very interesting and very exciting. But I think much more significantly, there are real resources for dialogues. We're talking about the same thing. What is human nature? Can we in effect say that theology and anthropology might offer us different perspectives on the way we are as human beings, or perhaps engage with questions at different levels? And it just seems to me that each of the disciplines might fill in part of a bigger picture, but that the two together might give us a richer understanding of what human nature is all about.
Look, from my point of view, theological languages are kind of like other cultures. And I know some theologians think of theology as sort of the antithesis to culture. I think of it as a species of culture. And what makes it exciting to me is that I think theological languages have a better track record than social science languages in tracking certain kinds of human experience that are very significant. Moral experience, the experience of the transcendent, which are present everywhere human communities are. Solidarity, hope, fear, but that social science somehow has not grappled with or has translated into other terms. So for me, this conversation is exciting because it's giving me tools to think in a better, more adequate way about the ethnography that I want to do.
In my own work, which has explored the intersection between effectively between anthropology and theology, what I've tried to do is attend to things that people very often take for granted, like the mood or the characteristic inner spiritual weather of a denomination, which is something I tend to write about. So I talk, for example, about, this is a characterization, but English Anglicanism as being a kind of mild, temperate ecclesiology. Very like the English weather, sunny, the odd outburst of shower, cloudy, the outlook mild. It seems to me that English Anglicanism on one level sacralizes mildness. It really believes that that's a good temperament to actually embody, and it does that really. The other thing that one can do with this is also begin to look at other things that people don't usually pay attention to, like, for example, the function of humour in denominations. I think most people would agree that Jewish jokes runs to many, many volumes, but the Book of Brethren jokes is a very slim pamphlet. So how denominations or religious groups value humour and what they do with it actually tells us something quite important about the register of a denomination or a sect and the way in which they can cope with ambivalence, irony, self-deprecation. And these, of course, are quite important pieces of theological material. If you can cope with irony and self-deprecation, you're quite likely to have a broad theological output. If you really can't cope with irony and self-deprecation, it's likely that things will be rather narrower and possibly a bit more sectarian.
There are certain real excitements in bringing theology and anthropology together, particularly if you're concerned with the kinds of claims that are made by believers, practitioners in religious traditions. And I'm predominantly concerned with questions of truth, and I see these playing out in all kinds of discussions that we're having together at the moment. I would say that predominantly the excitement that I'm really wanting to explore with colleagues in both disciplines concern two areas in which the claims we make can be understood as being incomplete in important ways. One is in thinking about the contexts in which certain kinds of claims are made, and the other is in thinking at the scale at which we're operating, both in terms of thought and in practice. So in the first kind of incompleteness, we're dealing with certain kinds of problem where we ask, is such and such true? This is a claim we might make. We for example, would say, Jesus Christ is fully God and fully human. Is it true, we might wonder. And a certain kind of discipline comes into play when one says, if one is speaking inside a particular community, in this case a Christian community in the Western tradition and Eastern traditions, one would say, yes, it's true, Jesus Christ is fully God and fully human. But a more philosophically nuanced kinds of approach to that question becomes important when you realize that certain groups deny this claim. And so one would ask in an open-ended way, under what conditions would one affirm that this is a true claim? And that will have a different kind of answer from simply saying yes or no. So a kind of binary opposition between yes, it's true, no, it's not true, becomes a more triadic claim when one asks what are the conditions under which one would affirm it or deny it. Anthropology is a supremely sophisticated discipline for asking those kinds of contextual questions. I think they're of greater philosophical importance. I think they play out very importantly in theology. On the second kind of question, which is about scale, it's really quite remarkable that both anthropologists and theologians, when considering certain kinds of questions of belief and practice, operate at least three scales. Now, I've learned to speak in this way from the work of Timothy Jenkins, and the three levels at which scale operates are the local scale, the middle distance, or even better, the complex middle distance, and the vast, or the cosmological. And theology often operates at a way which deals with the middle distance and sometimes the cosmological. Anthropology often operates at the local as well as the middle distance. When they are taken together, one is forced to operate on all three levels. This comes to a particular head under one particular condition, which is that major cosmological shifts in perspective, that's to say when, for example, Christian groups to which I belong, when we change our minds about fundamental ontology, it's often precipitated by quite small, local scale shifts.
I'm excited about bringing these disciplines together because there's clearly this fluorescence of thinking about the anthropology of Christianity and religion in general has really become a very interesting topic for anthropologists as religion has grown around the world, become more politically potent in many ways. And I think theologians who think about, obviously, religion all the time and have thought deeply about what it means, both in terms of its sort of normative questions as well as in terms of its lived realities, have something to offer anthropologists, and I hope, vice versa. I think, in fact, theologians have gotten quite comfortable drawing on anthropology, but I think in going the other way, that anthropologists have been nervous because of the normative issues that theologians are wrestling with. Anthropologists have kept them at arm's length, so I think it's great to see this come together and to think about what are the sort of productive places where we can connect.
I think it's time to re-examine the ways in which theology and anthropology have been mutually implicated with one another since the inception of anthropology, even though there's a great deal of denial about this. So we need to look at, through a historical lens, at moments of seeming fracture between the two disciplines, which at the same time were actually moments of mutual influence, possibly not so conscious. And that's, I think, an undertaking that is going to be quite lengthy. But I think the reason why it's important to be done now, which has been outlined by Joel Robbins at this conference, is that anthropology itself is suffering a little bit of a normative aporia at the moment. It lost some grand narratives that it used very distinctively and creatively in the 70s. Post-structuralism seemed to do death to those. It became enmeshed in forms of relativism which have almost become its hallmark. And so it has a certain envy of theology for its greater theological bravery, if you like. But in order to understand quite how it might recover its courage, some kind of review of how it has been interestingly implicated with theology from its inception, I think, is worthwhile. Secondly, from the theological side, I think that theology has an enormous amount to learn from anthropology, because theology, academic theology in the 20th century, has, with some noble exceptions, to a large extent distanced itself from observation of its own participants in the field. And in order to maintain its status within the university, it's become more and more semantically obfuscating, more and more incomprehensible to the ordinary practicing Christian. And this in itself, I think, is a mistake if it is ultimately to maintain influence culturally. Thus, to help it re-establish its connections with its own practitioners, you might say, anthropology seems to me to be a very important party that it should relate to.
I find the possibility of enriching anthropology through engaging another field with its own very sophisticated ways of thinking and long history. I find that just exciting on the face of things, even before we know what we're going to learn. I think anthropology, I think any field, when it gets into really productive dialogue with a field that it hasn't had that in before, it opens itself to all kinds of possibilities. On a more specific level, and we've talked a lot about that at this conference, a couple of things I think are really strong possibilities for good things that can come out of this dialogue. One of them is, in an interesting way, a possibility of anthropology understanding itself better. Why at this moment can it talk to theology? What's it like to see yourself in the mirror of another discipline? I mean, anthropology is constantly trying to get the cultures that anthropologists come from to reflect on themselves by going to other places, but we more rarely have deep encounters with other disciplines and use that to look back on ourselves. Some of the themes that came up at this conference were really interesting. Was the kind of theoretical moment we're in anthropology, where what we ended up calling vast theory or grand theory here is not at its high water mark, and also the fact that relativism isn't such an impulse now. It turns out that one of the sticking points between anthropology and theology, at least as this conference and its predecessor conference showed, was an anthropological impulse to insist on relativism as a way of disqualifying any universal claims anybody else might make. I mean, it's not that anthropologists may not still feel that impulse, but we didn't have to lead with it. We didn't have to establish that. I think that tells us something interesting about the moment that anthropology is in. I'm not even sure what my opinion of that moment is, but I think it tells us something interesting about that. So I think we can learn tremendous things about ourselves. I also think, given a shared interest in Christianity, that we as anthropologists can become much more sophisticated in our understanding about the depth of engagement with certain kinds of problems that Christians have had through time and history, and in an intellectual register as well as a practical register. I think we often kind of imagine that what we find in the field is sort of a one-off, and I'm constantly confronted with the fact that that is rarely ever true. And oftentimes, if you keep pushing back, you find that it was developments in theology, often even academic theology, that produced things that we're seeing all over the world. I mean, one example that didn't come up at this conference at all is spiritual warfare, which was developed very explicitly as a theological project that then became a kind of practical project with a very elaborate ritual life that's now all over the world. But often anthropologists, we find it in the field, we make sense of it only locally, and it's important to make sense of it locally, but to know where these things are located in the Christian tradition and in the history of Christian thought, I think is wonderful. What anthropologists can offer to theologians, probably not my place to say, but it was clear at this conference in an interesting way that it brought theologians to laying out in ways that they may or may not do a lot outside of these kind of contexts, the way in which they see certain kinds of theological positions being lived out in Christian practices in various churches and parishes and things. So I think there's a lot to be gained on both sides from this.
And through this project, we've been able to gather together some significant theologians and anthropologists who are willing to engage the disciplines of anthropology and theology in appropriate ways. Now, granted, this is the first step among many steps that will need to be taken, but it is significant that we've made that first step. And we look forward to the ongoing conversation that this project creates.